Ian says all that, but the truth is he's definitely my hero. Even like I'm teaching this term, and as early as Tuesday, I was using slides that referenced to you. Still, because no matter what the topic was, his privacy topics have changed, Ian always had this incredibly insightful way to think about it or to look at the situation. And I'm grateful to be here. I noticed when I went through customs, the guy says, well, why are you here? And do you come to Canada often? And I said, usually when there's a Republican president, I do tend to come a lot often. When Bush was here, Canada was my lifeline, given all that we went through after 9/11. But it's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for making this possible, for having this opportunity. So, technology design and technology designers in particular are sort of the new policymakers. We don't know their names, we didn't vote for them, but yet the decisions they make and the technology they build dictate how we live our lives. Let me give you an example. This is what a camera looked like when in the United States we were trying to figure out what were going to be the rules for photographing people in public. And it turned out that the American jurisprudence says, well, it's okay, you can photograph anyone you want in public without their consent. This is what a telephone looked like when American jurisprudence was trying to determine what were going to be the rules for recording a conversation. And the decision was that, well, you need someone's consent to record a conversation. And whether you need one party or all parties depends on which state, but you at least need some consent. Then, does anybody know what this is? This is like an age check. You know what this is? It is a camcorder. It is the Sony camcorder. In 1984, Sony introduced the Sony camcorder. It was the first commercial mass market product for videotaping, which included video and sound. And the camcorder had no mute button. That meant that it was impossible, or you could almost see the collision happening. That what were people going to do when they started recording with the video camcorder and they didn't necessarily have a way of turning off the voice, meant that they ran the risk of electronic wiretapping laws, of conflicting with that. And sure enough, one of the first cases was a woman in Pennsylvania. She strapped one of those things to her child, and it recorded these abuses by the bus driver with respect to the child. So she takes the video recording to the police department, and she says, look, go arrest him. And they arrested her on felony charges for illegal wiretapping. Another case that came up was in Boston. Boston University police was arresting a protester, and somebody pops up with one of those camcorders, and the policeman stops arresting the protester, turns around, arrests the guy that was doing the filming. And he too faced 7 years in prison for felony charges. Now we fast forward to today, in recent times. Now the Pennsylvania recently passed a law saying that it was okay to videotape in buses, all buses, school buses as well as regular buses. The American Civil Liberties Union led through lawsuits that ended up with the result that it's okay to record public officials in the service of their duties. And so that was one of the, if you follow the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, that was sort of why people weren't arrested after that. But notice that just because of a mute button, all of a sudden we changed our laws. And a mute button only costs a fraction of a penny. And one thing about technology is once you get a design that's working commercially, we just keep replicating it. And so even today, if you pull out a cell phone, like an iPhone and so forth, they too do video recordings, but they also have no mute button. And so it's kind of interesting that the design ended up dictating policy. This is a sleep number bed. Sleep number beds are really air mattresses. And so the idea is you can set the firmness by how much air you put in it. One of the new things they have is this thing called Sleep IQ. The volume keeps going up and down. There we go. sleep IQ, which are these sensors that are across the top of the bed, and they monitor your breathing and movement throughout the night. Then when you wake up in the morning, you can go online and see how well you slept. And what's interesting about that is the information, it's sensitive enough that even a cat, it registers even a cat laying on the bed, or when the cat moves and when the cat gets off the bed. And the information leaves your house, goes to a server, and you only get the access that they give you, and it has no way to even download it. This is a smartwatch, and smartwatches also, and I have one here, and they're also trying to monitor and trying to tell me when I need to exercise and so forth. But the difference of the design here is the information goes from the watch to my phone. It's not going to a third party. A very totally different design decision, and based on that design decision, different ramifications happen. I use those as examples to say that we really do live in a technocracy, and how these arbitrary decisions are exactly that. They're kind of arbitrary. Like, no, it's not like some philosophical position that people hold, and therefore designing the technology in the spirit of that, it's really arbitrary, and it's kind of scary. I'll tell you how I got here. When I'm a computer scientist by training, and when I was a graduate student at MIT, I had a passion for computer science, and I loved them dearly. Loved what technology could do, what it could be. And computer science is about designing tomorrow's technology. So it's sort of like you take your imagination and you sort of make it come true. Who knows if it'll be viable, but at least it gives you this notion. And so one day I'm walking through the lounge, and the ethicist was visiting from a nearby university, and I heard her say technology is evil. So I had to stop and fix her thinking, because clearly. And she went on about how this database had been released about the government employees and retirees and their families, and she sort of really foretold all of the things that were to unfold later. The year was 1996, and she went on and said that, look, that information goes out, the individuals don't have control over it anymore. People could use it to blackmail judges and so forth, and then I started telling her all the benefits of having technology available and having the data, how many lives it could save and so forth. And I said, besides, the data doesn't have people's name on it, so there's nothing to really worry about. And she said, well, they say it's anonymous, is it? And the data were given out in the sort of circle that you see over here. It didn't have name or address, but it did have basic demographics along with medical information. And so I did a sort of back of the envelope calculation that there are 365 days in a year. Let's say people live 100 years, that's 36,500 combinations, and 2 genders, that's 73,000. But the typical zip code or postal code in the United States only has about 20,000 people. So that meant that those demographics were pretty unique. And I said, oh man, that's amazing. And the governor of Massachusetts at the time was William Weld, and he had collapsed and people didn't know much about him. And I wanted to see if this was really true. So for $20, I purchased the voter list for the city of Cambridge. It had 54,805 voters, but only 6 of them lived in his zip code. Only 3 of them were men, and he was the only one with that date of birth. That meant that date of birth, gender, and zip code was unique for him, and we could put his record back by name and just be able to identify him. And so in that moment, I started out trying to correct her thinking, and I just sort of realized, uh-oh, we sort of have a problem. And the problem turned out, I didn't realize it at the time, I was a graduate student, and like within a month, I'm all of a sudden testifying before Congress. Because it turned out that this wasn't just this random data set being released this way. This was actually how it was done around the world. It was done here in Canada this way. It was done in many, many countries. And the issue was, all of a sudden, these voter lists, no one had actually, the technology even at that time the voter list came on 2 floppy diskettes, and so that's the status of technology. But what does it mean today? So today, as we fast forward to now, what it was 20 years later, or more, no, 20 years later, now we have a situation where we live very much, our lives are pretty transparent. Our data about our lives are completely open. But what happens once the data leaves us, sort of like in the sleep number bed situation? So suppose you use a mobile app. Who else gets your data? Right? Well, when I was at the Federal Trade Commission, we were interested in this question, who else gets your data? So the Federal Trade Commission is kind of the police of the internet, and that's kind of because its mandate covers unfair practices, deceptive, consumer protection type issues, and because a lot of these technology companies are American companies, that sort of sticks the FTC in the middle of things. And so we began sort of snooping on phones as to what kind of information they were leaking. And each of these is personal information. This is like the name, your address, medical information, and so forth. So you would expect Amazon to be sending information to Amazon.com. You would probably expect Facebook to send stuff to Facebook, though not necessarily to Google. And text-free, well, if it's free, it goes everywhere. All kinds of things about you go. We looked at, these are from the top 100 apps. And this is Android. I can tell because this particular Android phone calls a Google website every 10 seconds. Isn't that pretty interesting? It was a Samsung phone, and it was calling all apps tend to have some communication with Google. So right away, you're like, Google knows everything. If you visit the website, though, you can see what particular apps give on what kind of information particular apps give about you. So suppose someone gets arrested. So in the United States right now, lots of people are getting arrested, primarily from protesting. There's a lot of protests happening. And, just because you got arrested doesn't mean you're even guilty, right? We've historically not wanted individuals. The idea of private arrest is something we never wanted. So as a culture and as our society, if you get arrested, that's become public information. But nowadays, what happens to that? Well, if you were to Google some people's names, you would often see images of their mugshots showing up. This particular issue came to us by a woman who had a most compelling story. She lived in Texas, and one day she and her husband are out to dinner, and he goes to the restroom and the phone goes off. And she picks up the phone, and she doesn't recognize the number. She answers it, and it turns out he's having an affair. So when he comes back to the table, she challenges him about that. And he says, he says, not only am I having an affair, but I like her better than you. And he leaves. She looks across the room. She sees over in the bar someone she recognizes. So she goes over there, and they decided the best thing for her to do is to just get drunk. So she gets incredibly drunk. It's now 2 o'clock in the morning. She gets her keys. She gets in the car. She hits it 60 miles an hour as it goes flying over the curb, hits a tree, and she and her friend both end up in the hospital. In the hospital, she's accused of, she gets arrested for drunk driving. So she had a mugshot. And later on, she divorces her husband. She's getting her life together. And she Googles her name, and up pops this mugshot. And so what she noticed was this expunged in the upper right corner. And so she had to pay a fee, and they would take her name down. So she pays the fee, except when she pays the fee, she's fine for a while. A week or two later, she Googles her name, up pops these mugshots, because there's all these different companies that are doing the same thing, like 12 or 13 companies that are doing the same thing. So how do they get the information? Well, it's the same free information we had before, but they figured a way to, I would argue it's extortion. What happened? Okay, maybe it's not extortion. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. So the next slide would have said, you took the bar exam. Who got your score? So we had a case last year where the California bar Association was asked to turn over the bar scores for everyone who had taken the bar, whether they passed or not, and their GPAs, their LSATs, and so forth, going back 30 years. And the arguments were made that the data could be de-identified sufficiently, and so they had a whole army of people and teams of people telling us what the best practices were and so forth, and they came up with 4 different protocols. And they said, so clearly you can give us the data because after all, the data is sufficiently de-identified. Nobody can be re-identified. And we were able actually within the court, being able to re-identify judges, congressional members, lawyers, seniors, partners, and so forth. And it was pretty amazing. Not my computer. But it's working. I use this as an example that, it's the past practices coming back in weird ways. So far we've looked at all of these, so we looked at mobile phones, we looked at, what else did we look at? We looked at mobile phones, we looked at, which one? Yes, we looked at the Fitbit stuff. And another one that we became interested in was the question of where does your health data go? Oh, I know what I was going to tell you next. Election vulnerability. So last year, the students and I decided we were going to track the 2016 election and look for vulnerabilities of how somebody could use technology in these sort of unforeseen ways to actually influence the election. And we had big impacts right away. Like when we got to one of the states, North Carolina, we saw a lot of misinformation on the state website as to telling people the wrong place to go voting, where they would vote, but we got that corrected 2 days before the primary. And in Riverside, California, though, a really interesting thing happened. A large number of people in the Republican primary were actually given, their address had been changed by someone, and when they went to vote, they couldn't vote because they weren't on the voting register for that polling place. Because when you change the voter's address, they end up going, you think you got it? I think they have it. Let's check it out. Let's see if I can break it. Thank you. So in Riverside, California, they went to vote, and they actually ended up unable to vote. So what happens in the United States when you show up and you say, but I've been voting here for 25 years, what's wrong with you? They have a sort of an emergency panic button, and it's called a provisional ballot. They give the person a provisional ballot, the person votes, but those votes don't count in most states. So this became a really interesting thing for it's a pacifier. It stops the drama in the election booth, and now, but it doesn't count. So we became really interested in, that's a really interesting strategy, changing people's addresses online. How many states could you do it? What does it mean to change somebody's address online? So 36 states had online the ability to actually change, a voter could change their information online. The question was, how did the website know it's you? Well, in Delaware, they know it's you because you give your last name, your date of birth, and your social security number. And then in another state, you might give part of a driver's license number or part of a social security number. And so we became interested in, what does it take to impersonate any voter in any of these states, to change their address, to disenfranchise any voter that you might want to do? And it was pretty amazing. We've learned that of the 36 states, we could purchase social security numbers for around $1 a person, or cheaper if we got it on the dark web. That's just over-the-counter pricing. $2 for a driver's license. Some driver's license we didn't even have to buy because they're actually encoded from dates of birth and things like this. And then, of course, we go to the dark web where we've got all the breach data and other kinds of places, people selling this data at bulk. So it becomes really inexpensive to do this at scale. Michelle Obama points out often that they won the election not in 2009 and 2012, not by a lot of people having changed their mind or maybe a lot of people being disenfranchised, but exactly a couple of counties, a couple of people in a particular county. 100 voters in one county made the difference for a whole state. And so we certainly saw that in the last election. So we'll have to see if we have evidence that people exploited this vulnerability. So stay tuned to this, and you can read our paper. It's coming out. What do I use? Here we go. So you visit your doctor. Who else gets your data? So we don't have the cultured system of health that you have. We have a crazy system. But if you were to ask an American pretty much where all your medical record information goes, they would probably say the employer, your insurance company, and so forth. This is what we were able to track. If you visit the site, this is where all the places a typical person's medical record goes. If you visit the website and click on a note, it'll list for you, we have over 2,000 vendors, and what is the evidence that we have that says that they engage in this particular kind of sharing. The solid lines, the data is explicitly identified with your name, the dash, it's de-identified. And one of the things that was interesting is we have a medical privacy law in the United States called HIPAA, and the links that you see right here are all flows that are not covered by HIPAA. A little bit more than half of the flows that we've been able to document are actually not even covered by any regulation in the United States. This one thing that's in the middle here, this discharge data, if you ask a typical American what the heck is discharge, well, do you guys know what discharge data is? Well, you probably have it too, but if in the United States, no one would know what it is either, even though almost everyone is in it. So in the United States, if you go to a doctor's office or you go to the hospital, a copy of the information about that visit goes to the state. It's called discharge data. And then the state can either give it away or sell it. And you can see it's really a big part of what's happening in this graph. In fact, 33 of the states sell it or give it away, and only 3 of them do so in a way with protections that's as strong as HIPAA. Since they're not covered by HIPAA, they get to choose how they're going to give the data away. So this is an interesting question because it could be that HIPAA is too strong. Maybe it's just kind of messing up the data more than it needs to. It's redacting the data more than it needs to, and that these states, these other 30 states, kind of have a better deal going on. So for $50, Washington State is the one up in the corner. I purchased a year's worth of their data, 2011. That was pretty much every hospitalization in the state of Washington for the $50. This is a condensed version of it. One record went on for about 300 fields of data. And so you can see it's de-identified. It doesn't have a person's name. It does have their age and years and months, their gender, the 5-digit zip code where they live. Gives you what they were diagnosed with. It doesn't give the exact date they came in, but it gives you some basic information. And it costs $71,000 for this hospitalization. And so we were interested in, could you figure out whose medical record that is? Is that me too? Am I doing that too? Wow. How about, is that better?
Nope.
No, it's not me. Is it me? Is it me? I'll just hold it. It was that election talk, right? So, is this working okay for everybody? Oh, it's off. It's working much better now.
It's not making that funny noise anymore.
It's not making the funny noise. I don't have to worry about my volume. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So anyway, so we were worried. So the question is, how can I figure out whose medical record it is? So Harvard at the library, they have one of those archives that archives some of the newspapers in Washington State. And so I pulled out these kinds of blotter stories. So a man, 60 years old, had a motorcycle accident, and he went to, and his name is Ronald Jameson. And what I want to know is, can I figure out exactly of this stack of 1 million records, which one is his? And if so, maybe I can't figure out exactly his, but maybe I could narrow the choices. So we just start matching up things. This is not, and for those of you who have a mathematical background or something like that, there is no math here. I mean, actually just matching. No statistical probabilistic matching at all. So he was from a motorcycle and so forth, and we found exact matches in a little less than half of the samples that we had. One and only one record that matched it. The Bloomberg News, then, people, there's an inconvenient truth. These re-identifications are very disruptive, and there's kind of an inconvenient truth to them. And so my critics over the years have said, well, only you could do it, or it can't really be done, or you did the re-identification, and yes, it's only one and only one, but you don't really know it's him. So to deal with my critics, half of these matchups were done by me, and half were done by a random person that I hired through a temp agency. And the only qualification was that you knew how to use the internet. And we gave them all to Bloomberg News with an agreement that they wouldn't print anyone's information unless the person agreed. So this particular guy, and they found every match was exactly correct, right? And this particular guy, it turns out he actually he's a diabetic, and he had a diabetic attack. So all of these examples go to this idea that there's lots of data about me, it's going everywhere without my permission. And yeah, if I think about Google and Facebook, in theory you could say I have some say, but on the other hand, how do you live without Facebook and Google? It's not so easy. But for all of the examples I've given you, the individual has no control over that, right? All this hidden data sharing, and you might be being harmed, but it's impossible to know when so much is hidden. So I claim that we live in a technocracy. This technocracy is one in which the information about us, our lives, are totally globally open, and that's globally open because any data that I could get on the internet, anybody else could get it too, anywhere else, and the risk and harms are hidden. So let me give you another story. One day I was at Harvard, and I was being interviewed by a reporter. And the reporter, I had to look up a paper. So we went to Google my name, and yes, Google is a verb. So I went to Google my name. What is it? Why is it doing its own thing? It's like, blowing my story, man. Oh, because it doesn't have,
automation.
they were supposed to clicks. Anyway, so we Google my name, and I tell him, there's the story we're looking for. He says, forget that story, tell me about this arrest. I said, well, I've never been arrested. He says, then why does it say you've been arrested? And I said, well, that's impossible, I've not been arrested. So I go to the Instant Checkmate site, I pay the requisite fee, I show him that there is no arrest record for anyone named Latanya Sweeney. And he said, then why did your computer, why is Google doing that? And I said, and so almost like a flashback to let me fix your thinking about technology. You're just so wrong. Google's not going to be doing that. No one's doing that on purpose. So we started Googling other names. And so every time we would Google a name, like these Latanyas, we would get these ads that implied their of arrest. And so he says, sorry about that, guys. I'm used to my unfolding. So he says, oh, that's because you have one of those black-sounding names. Now, he's a white Italian-American, and I'm like, what are you talking about, black-sounding names? So one, you don't know about technology, and two, I don't know what you're talking about, black-sounding names. But then I said, okay, you can't see because it doesn't animate. So when you Google Latanya, you see black faces. When you Google Tanya and you look for images, you see these faces. So there clearly is this idea that names are associated more with one race than another. So eventually, in order to prove him right or wrong, I ended up having to capture ads, over 140,000 ads being delivered on the names of 3,000 people half of whom's first name is given more often to black babies than white babies, and half of whom's first name is given more often to white babies than black babies in the United States, and found that 80% of the time, if you have one of these black names, the first name was given more often to black babies, you got an arrest ad. And 20% as opposed to a neutral ad. So discrimination is not illegal, right? Well, I can't speak for Canada, I'm not a lawyer. But in the United States, I can tell you discrimination is not illegal. We give student discounts, senior citizen discounts as I'm getting up there. But what is illegal in the United States, we have a Civil Rights Act that says certain groups in certain situations are protected. And one of those groups are blacks, and one of those situations is employment. So if you've got a job applicant and you Google their name and you see an arrest ad, even if you don't go to see whether or not there really is an arrest record, it definitely has a chilling effect. It's not an equal playing field. So what was interesting about this study was it was the first time that someone had said, hey, wait a second, how do you enforce something like the Civil Rights Act on technology? And so this was the first study, and this sort of led to a new field, a new area of work on algorithmic discrimination and fairness and transparency in algorithms. Later, when I went to the FTC, I learned that the company had actually been fined and Google had pledged never to show these kinds of ads again. So it was really effective. This one interesting social science experiment had a lot of ramifications, had a lot of upsides to it. But it also reminds us that unlike all of the other examples I gave you, which were privacy, this wasn't about privacy. It's every democratic value is starting to come up for grabs. Privacy was just the first wave. Let me give you some more examples. This is the Pittsburgh Courier. It's the oldest black newspaper in the United States, and at its peak of circulation, it had about 200,000 subscribers. And if you wanted to place an ad in the Pittsburgh Courier, they had a whole staff that would decide whether or not your ad was appropriate for their viewing audience. This is what the Pittsburgh Courier looks like today. It's a website whose ads are delivered by the Google Ad Network, so there's no one to curate them. So at the FTC, we became really interested in you can't see. I'll have to tell you what you missed from the animation. So we became really interested in the FTC is what is the online experience, what's the ad experience of different websites, like of something like the Pittsburgh Courier. So we tracked Omega Sci-Fi, which is a black fraternity, and they were having their 100th year anniversary. And we wanted to see what kinds of ads were being delivered to the site. So there were ads for graduate programs, and there were ads for travel, and then there were these kind of unwanted ads about arrest records and being a criminal lawyer. And then there were these credit card ads. And credit cards are also something that's under the Credit Card Fair Credit Reporting Act is also under the FTC. So the question was what kind of credit card ads are being delivered there? So these would be considered the best credit cards, and these would be considered the worst credit cards. And we only saw ads on the website for the worst credit cards. And then we said, well, where are these other ads showing up? So American Express Blue, by most accounts, is the best credit card. And they had been running a campaign at that time that clearly showed up at lots of education sites, which really begged the question why Omega Sci-Fi didn't get it. Whereas the most criticized card, the kind of cards that did show up at Omega Sci-Fi, kind of had this it wasn't clear what the theme was, or if there was a theme as to why it showed up. So what was becoming interesting at that point for me was not just that these unforeseen consequences of technology were beyond privacy and going into other areas, but that also we could use experiments. We could do things to actually figure out what's going on. You know, the weld example was an experiment. How do I put this together? The arrest ads was an experiment. the credit card was an experiment, and every time I was doing one of these, it was having an impact on policy. It was sort of shoring up our established regulations and legal frameworks. And so could we harness it even further? I'll give you one more example. So this is also from the FTC. We were interested in how do I understand, so this is with the fraud. So can you tell that I just sort of went all over the FTC? So when you're the chief technology officer, the organization just seems flat. And like for me, that was great. Because you could just get a group of people together around an issue, and the oversight of that group, we could just make decisions really quick. It was really an amazing experience. And it's sort of like being inside of Spider-Man's den. It was just really awesome. Now, when you go to the FTC's website or you see one of the commissioners talk, you would say, is that the same place she was talking about? And the reason is that this is not a part of the administration. These agencies are separate entities, but they're run by 5 commissioners. 2 of them have to be in the opposing party. And so anything that comes out at the commissioner level is come through a political process. The FTC that I love, that got all this stuff done, we just made sure it never got to the commissioner level, right? And then we just had, they went up against government agencies. It was pretty amazing. So that we were interested in what is the online experience based on your demographics. So we invented this new index called Exclusivity Index. It's the percentage of people in your group divided by the sum of all of the other groups. This is an example with Latino households visiting Univision, divided by the sum of all the other type of households visiting Univision. And the closer this number is to 1, the more exclusive that website is to that demographic. That demographic could be age, it could be income, it could be race. So this is an example with children. That is, households that have children go to websites that households that don't have children never go to. And so you sort of see this really sharp divide between the reds and the blues. And this line here is 2 standard deviations. I mean, something happening up here is pretty significant. It's that exclusive, is the way to think about it. So what do those websites look like? Well, they look like pbskids.org and disney.com and so forth. And that makes sense. But we could also do this on other groups, and we did them on all types of groups. So here's an example on race. And so for Asians, you see India Times and Yoku.com, for example. For Latinos, we talked about Univision. World Star Hip Hop, that sort of makes sense for blacks. But Foot Locker is kind of interesting. Foot Locker, why would you believe that any race would be more exclusive to one race than another? So some of these websites are really interesting. Now the reason we care about this exclusivity is because fraud, real fraud that's investigated by the FTC, the kind of fraud where you turned over your entire bank account, the kind of fraud where you gave away your inheritance, the kind of fraud that you gave somebody your car, happens the more exclusive the website. Because the more exclusive the website, the more you're with your own people, in a sense, the higher the trust, the easier the bigger frauds happen. And frauds are very specific to particular demographic groups. So we were able to use that as a way of showing exactly how to find these frauds, because online fraud is very difficult. By the time the FTC gets enough notice that there's been a problem, and then they go look for the fraudster is long gone. And so being able to find these sites early on, find the ad while it's being displayed, or finding the discussion in which the person's trying to convince a group to give money or participate in something, was very helpful. So then I leave the FTC, but as I'm leaving the FTC, I realize as I look back on the work, even from my graduate student going forward, that what I was really engaging in was this idea of helping the helpers. That is, trying to restore back the protections that advocates, regulators, and journalists already gave our society, but if they only knew how to think about, or only had tools or technologies to help shore them up. And so when I left there, I decided that I really wanted to build an army. So I had a big impact, or at least it seemed that way to me, on the government in that one day the chairwoman calls me in and she says that she would like to hire a lot of technologists. She could even imagine a bureau of technologists because it was pretty much a law shop. It was just pretty much all lawyers. And then you realize there's no one there. She could hire them, even if she found a way to hire all these people. There's no people to hire. We don't train anyone to do this. We don't train anyone to do these kinds of social science experiments in the space of technology and to really make these points. So when I came back to Harvard, I was determined to change this. So I taught a course called Data Science to Save the World. And I told the students, I said, look, at the end of this term, you're going to do a project. And if your project's really good, I'll take you down to DC and I'll introduce you to regulators. And so I set money aside to take down about 3 students. At the end of the term, 26 students had crossed the bar of work that was significant enough to take down. So I took 26 students down to DC, and it was a pretty electric experience. Like I said, the typical regulator is a lawyer, a middle-aged lawyer, and here are these students, and the students are talking, we set it up like a project fair, and the students are talking about things and technologies and apps that the regulators had never even heard of. And they were giving them insight into what were the problems. And the regulators were giving back, and were asking questions of the students, sharpening the idea of where actually is the problem. How do you think about the problem? Well, of the experiment you just did, what about this way or that way? And it was fantastic. It was supposed to last for 2 hours. It went for 4 hours. And the vibe in the room, it was completely electric. So we leave there. I said, that was just too good. We can't just let it stop there. So I said, oh, I know what we should do. We should start a journal. We should start a journal in the way law schools have journals. So we could have a Harvard Papers on Technology Science. And so the idea was that other schools would have one too, and so forth. So when Harvard says, well, if you want to use our name, you've got to go get an outside people to say it's good enough. I was like, but I'm a professor here. Anyway. So I do the equivalent of an email Rolodex, and I ask 50 people if they would be on this board, thinking I could just get a few. And 48 of them said yes. And when 48 of people from around the world say yes to something like that, it is not a Harvard thing. So we dropped that whole Harvard thing. And we launched the Journal of Technology Science. It is open. It really focuses a lot on these unforeseen consequences. And the works have been pretty, very well received. The first papers, of course, were from those 26 students. So let me give you an example of what some of them were. This is a paper by Daniel Rothschild. He does one better than the exclusivity index for the FTC. He actually builds a very simple program that monitors tweets in real time, looking for known keywords of fraudulent ads, and finds them in real time. And in fact, so this was even a bigger impact than the work that I had done when I was there, because this tool allows them to check right as the tweet is happening. Not a website to go find and see when it showed up, but actually while it's happening. And so it really has turned a big part, some of their activity, from being a passive activity to being a much more active activity. This is students. So they're students. So they've recently taken the SAT not that long ago. So they had gone through Princeton Review. But they remembered that when they got the prize for Princeton Review, they had to give their zip code first. So what they did for their project is they mined the zip code out for all of the zip codes, the price out for all of the zip codes in the United States. And at this scale, it's clear that the Northeast pays more than most of the other part of the country, and there are these other little areas. That's at this scale. But if you zoom in and you come into the zip code level, you realize that, well, it's not all brown up in Massachusetts. It's primarily the areas that have a higher Asian community. Asians are almost twice as likely to be paying the higher price. And so for this one, they ended up on the Today Show, and a few other places. This is a similar price study. This is, the same hotel room. We're used to no two seats on an airplane costing the same, but hotel rooms a little bit different. But it really matters on the same day for the same hotel room, where in the world you ask the price from. So it was kind of interesting. This was another study. Some Harvard professors before had shown a difference on Airbnb between white host and black host in New York. These students took on the difference between white host and Asian host in California, the Berkeley area, and they found a much larger discrepancy, 20%, that Asians make about 20% less than white hosts. And Airbnb really responded to this. They set up this whole new pricing structure. I don't know if any of you used Airbnb, but so they now try to do recommended pricing and price controls to try to offset this feature. And they were very quick to respond to us about this. If you haven't heard of any of the other ones, you've probably heard about this one. So Facebook, for years, it was known in the media, in the tech media, that Facebook Messenger had a bug, which Facebook called a feature. And this bug was that as you send text messages, it leaks your GPS location. So if you were using Facebook Messenger pretty heavily, basically I could just plot you, if I had your GPS locations, I could just plot you throughout the day. So what Iran did was he made a little plugin so that you could actually do just that. You could log into Facebook, use the plugin, and track people. And so he put it online, it got downloaded over about 85,000 times, and within 9 days, Facebook changed that feature, right? Something they hadn't done for years, had been known, and they changed the feature. But the reason I think that you may have known about it is Facebook had hired him to do a summer internship there. And so they waited until he got all the way to California, the day before he was to show up, and they rescinded the offer. And so that's when it really went viral. Listen, don't feel bad for him. He got a TED Talk out of this thing. he ended up with a summer job, making almost twice what Facebook had offered him. I think that Facebook rescinded the offer, and within a day or two, he had the other job. So he made out quite well. In an article in Time magazine, so. But that was one of them. Well, I think we all know Facebook's privacy policies suck over time. They keep getting worse, and the only time they got better was when there was regulatory intervention. I'll just give you one more, and then we'll open it up for questions. These two students were studying the Affordable Care Act. This was also known as Obamacare. And what they were able to document was that the large insurance companies had stayed out of the health exchanges. And when it was clear that the exchanges were still going forward, the large insurance companies came in and drove the prices way up. And so they were able to document that and show that in the data. And so as the Center for Medicare and Medicaid responded somewhat immediately, so did several of the congressional committees and stuff like that, and passed new requirements for what you have to do if you raise your price, things like that. So the papers went out, they were pretty effective. They've had a lot of dramatic impact. And that's only a few of them. There's a lot more of them. You should feel free to look on the website and you'll see even more of them. But it's not just our students, it's not just my students, it's you too. I mean, so in some ways this talk was aimed a lot about what had happened to me. But in the end, it's not really about me, it's what you can do. It's about your ability to save the world. And notice that there's no computer science in that. There's no, I can only do it if I work for Google. It's really taking the skills that you have. The students who took this class, the students whose papers you see online, come from all kinds of disciplines. Some of the best papers were from the history of science students. Right? They brought the skill that they had from their discipline and simply applied it. So I just want to say, you too can save the world. Thank you. I know it's almost midnight.
Any questions? Yes.
Wait, what was that website you mentioned?
Oh, techscience.org. This one. And if you have a paper, submit it. Any other questions? Hi.
Yeah, hi. Stephanie Farron, you.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Everybody's talking about the problem with the different facts worlds that we're dealing with in journalism.
Fake news.
Yeah. Alternative facts. Is anybody working on a project to see, I mean, how do you stop innocent kids from stumbling onto the wrong reality and never getting out of that universe?
So,
It's a problem for education, really it is, you know?
well, since my computer, I have slides for that, but I won't show them because my computer refuses to do that. So we started, so I'm teaching technology to save the world this semester, and fake news is one of the things that we've been tackling. So Ethan Zuckerman has a wonderful sort of way of talking about fake news. So he says, you know, fake news is one of three kinds. There's the news that you just don't like, so it's fake because you just don't want to hear it. And then he says, you know, there's propaganda, and he describes propaganda as there's truth, but if we just twist it and look at it this other way, maybe add some false characterization to it, and he would say that's propaganda. And then there's this whole disinformation category. And the disinformation category is a category where your goal is to kind of flood the environment with news that is questionable or wrong or bad or made up, with the purpose of people losing trust in the system. And so, so one of the examples that I give the students, if I could show you the slide, is me on my working on my Facebook profile. And there are these ads that keep showing up. And the first one says, "Cher is dead." And it's like, what? Cher is dead? So now I spent 20 minutes trying to see if Cher really is dead. Right? And I came to the realization she's not dead because if you visit her site, you can buy a ticket to her show. So, then I go on, and then there's a thing about Melania Trump is breaking up. Like, really? And so I click, and then the thing I click on doesn't have anything to do with that, so I know that's not real. And we go through all this stuff. Then pops up an ad that I might really be interested in. It's about a bill, but you know what? I'm not going to click it anymore because by now I've learned my lesson, right? That I'm just wasting my time. And that's exactly the phenomena that Ethan talks about in disinformation. So it is the disinformation that we've been focusing on. I know different people are focusing on specifically different kinds of fake news. So there's false rumors. So there's a body of work around false rumors, and especially on Twitter and Facebook, and how they don't get squashed because of the way Facebook produces a rumor versus the way Twitter does. And the ones that we've been working on are these kinds of fake news advertising through Facebook. You know, what can be done about those. But people are working on it for sure. And President Trump is going to make a lot more people, I think, work on it. Yeah. I think people who care about the internet and want it to be a viable way forward have to really care about this idea of fake news, because otherwise you can trust nothing the internet says. And in some ways it's a real loss. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The time that you got a good kind of response from what you and your students have worked on, like when Facebook, updated what they're doing, is it usually because you find that it's media pressure that's done it, or is there any sort of consumer pressure that forces them to make these changes? If you can tell, if you know.
So, well, here's one lesson I learned from both the online ads and that Facebook example of Iran. The minute the business press picks it up where it can threaten their stock, they will respond immediately. The rest of the press, they will just stonewall it, don't really care. Airbnb was different. Airbnb became really proactive right away with the findings, wanted to come out and talk to us and stuff like that. So they were really different.
So from what you notice, do you still find that consumers are pretty close about it, they don't really care that much, or can you not really measure if there's a response from them?
Well, what could a consumer do, though?
Well, as in, people would stop using Facebook, people would stop using Airbnb if they felt that, issues.
So, I think it's a market fiction to believe that click-through agreements or that people really have a choice around Facebook or Google. I mean, they are really, yeah, Bing is there, you know. And DuckDuckGo, I know, I get it. But for the most part, we're kind of really dealing with monopolies. You can see that theory of mine didn't get me very far at the FTC, but I really, I feel as though there are monopolies, and so this idea that I have a choice to go somewhere else means, that means I'm going to be a second-class citizen, and you don't actually even know about all the data sharing with respect to Facebook or Google either. I was pretty amazed. We were working on this fake news on Facebook's platform, and if you type in just the right URL, you can actually find out what their ad profile of you is. And their ad profile is based on stuff like, we crossed your name with your email address with these places, and we know you're a customer of Amazon, and we know you're a customer of Target or whatever, and so forth. And it's just pretty amazing, this sort of back channel sharing. And there's nothing you can do about that. And so if you think about these examples, that's not anybody's story. So if you think about these examples, it's not a lot you could do about them. I mean, what were you going to do about the geolocation? Maybe find a place that you could turn it off if you wanted to go hunt for it. But I mean, is that really fair? Yes, sir.
I think we all know that data is very powerful, and a lot of these tech companies, their revenue model depends on being able to collect data and having many data receptors. But I guess with concerns with privacy law, would you say that if you can sort of figure out a way to make all data unidentifiable, like not be able to uniquely identify a single person, have we effectively solved the problem, or are there other issues as well?
Yeah, well, so first of all, de-identification has nothing to do with when the service is free, you are the product, right? I mean, they have nothing to do with it. So if I want to use Facebook or Google, they're not using de-identified data. And if I was supposed to get them to use de-identified data, the question there is, could I offer an alternative service that simply made a different privacy proposition? Absolutely. I can design 5 of them, and I can even make an economic argument for them, right? That they could be viable. But we haven't seen them, and part of we haven't seen them has to do with once somebody gets a lead with one design, we just tend to keep replicating the thing that worked for them. And so it becomes even harder to introduce an alternative design. But there have been some notions of people marching with their feet. Recently, people have been kind of annoyed with Uber. Both Uber's attitude, and then an issue came up with one of their female employees, and there has been a large exodus away from Uber in the United States, or at least in the neighborhoods that I hang out, away from Uber towards Lyft and Fasten, which is another another competitor. So maybe that's sort of, I think I answered your question without answering your question. Any more questions? Hi.
Yes.
Hi, Corinne. So I have like a million questions I could ask you, but the one I'm interested in, I think most is the Google research you did on racism and online, basically the algorithmic discriminatory sort. Part of Google's response was, hey, like it's not our fault, we're just reflecting the fact that people are racist. And so I wonder if you could sort of speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I actually even have a slide that might help. So this is sort of how it works. So you give them a certain, if you're an advertiser, you would give them the string that somebody searches on that string. This is how much you're willing to pay if they click your ad. This is how much money you're willing to give to Google. And then you get to give 5 copies of the ad that you want to see. And so the advertiser claimed that they had done the same, roughly the same 5 on all names in the United States. So roughly two or 3 were arrests and 2 were neutral. And so the way the algorithm works is it's trying to optimize Google's income. So at first it just randomly picks one of these and displays it. And the more somebody clicks on an ad, it's making more money, so it begins weighting those. So the more, if you click Ebony Glover arrested, if this gets the most clicks, then over time, this is the only ad that's going to be shown from here. And so the advertiser's argument was that what we were seeing was an artifact of society, that society was choosing these arrest ads if it was a black name and these neutral ads if it was a white name. But that turned out doesn't seem like that's the case given that they were fined by the FTC. I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure.
One of the things I remember reading you saying was, well, that's interesting then, but then, so how could you design an algorithm? What could computer scientists do to mitigate racism that's reflected in consumer choices?
So I don't think I have that slide. No. Okay, so when Google is delivering billions of ads a second, and the way that it's an online market, so you've got lots of these advertisers, a whole group of them over here, and you've got some websites over here, and somebody just came to that website, they've got to deliver an ad. In a fraction of a second, they look through there and they decide which ad they're going to deliver, not just which of these, but there's like maybe 1,000 of these competing. And they weight them all kinds of ways. They don't only just weight this one, which of this ad, they also, like, which company is a better company, who's done more business with us, has more reputable, they get a better weight. Which, they have other kinds of things that they weight. So these ideas of these kinds of biases could be something that they could check for themselves on sentiment analysis and keywords. Something really simple, and just simply weight it. So they never, they can even get to 79% disparity. They don't quite get to the 80% that would cause, the sort of the standard that causes a civil rights investigation. But they could do this on any of these categories, on any of the protected groups. They could just simply do that. So that was something that I had proposed to them. But Google, if you work for Google, many of you are law students. If you work for Google, what would your advice be to your client? You don't want to get out of business of having to enforce, policy. But, technically they're in the business of having to enforce policy because we live in a technocracy.
Maybe a last question? Yeah, Jan?
Is there somebody else?
Yeah, maybe we could take 2.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, who has the other?
Yeah. Well,
Sorry. So my question is kind of more abstract. I'm a data scientist, and a lot of these truths that a lot of these students are speaking out are things that are just kind of taken for granted within ethnic communities. Like, for example, trans women and women of color, when they record an offensive comment on Facebook, it takes longer to get processed by Facebook. Things of that nature. So, as someone who's not a data scientist, and as somebody who, often when we present these claims, you're seen as being too sensitive or you're making stuff up, how do we address these issues? Because I personally find it very frustrating because they're on one hand not taking it seriously, two, I don't have those technical tools. I can sue everybody that doesn't really work. So.
Well, I don't know, lawsuits can be kind of sobering. I understand. I don't know that I have a great answer for you other than, so the Ford Foundation and several of the other foundations have put a lot of money on the table to try to get this kind of work, this idea of technologists into civil society organizations. So the idea is, we already have organizations who are fighting for gay and lesbian rights. We already have organizations who are fighting all these different fights. could we get a technologist into teach them how to do what they're doing and the issues that they care about in the same, have someone embedded that looks through that lens. And so they put a lot of money on the table to do this. We still don't have a large number of people doing it. So that's not quite the answer I know you're looking for, but it's some of what I have.
So, one of the things that I know that I like when I'm introducing students to technology law, one of the concepts I like to have them think about at first goes back to Larry Lessig's famous work of code, and this notion of what he calls the is-ism, where he tries to sort of set out this idea that people make this mistake that the internet is one particular thing, it has an essence, and that essence somehow is its essence and it won't change. And so, of course, his whole work is premised on his concern that we'll shift from architectures of freedom to architectures of control. I'm not in any way suggesting that you assert any kind of is-ism, but your work, I think, is premised on this idea of the internet as this global and free and place that we can get access and stuff. And I'm just curious, do you worry, especially in the political times that we've sort of been alluding to, about the internet, what it is changing in ways that will challenge your work, or how do you think about that with students in terms of that sort of more basic question about what kind of an internet do we need to have for technology to be able to save the world?
Well, it's not even the internet all the time. Last year we took students to a track where Consumer Reports test cars, and the question was to what extent the students could find ways, unforeseen consequences of these cars. And they came up with stuff right away, and I use that as an example because the internet isn't the internet anymore anyway. The idea of there's an online and an offline is kind of gone, my toaster wants to say stuff about me, it's, your refrigerator, you can't even, so, one of the students did a study, Samsung televisions, taking sound clips out of the room. Like, what is with that? And so, this idea that the internet is an abstract thing is, I don't think, a part of what we address, because it's really sort of these unforeseen consequences of technology as technology is presenting itself. Including these personal dolls, where they're really, somebody else might be your voice and having this intimate conversation with your child, things like that. So those are also on the table of things to talk about and discuss. So I think I'm agreeing with you that the internet isn't the internet that we came to know is certainly not the space of technology of concern as we're going forward. It's much bigger than that.
I wondered if maybe you shared a concern that I think I have, which is that potential shifts in the way the internet is will actually hamper the kind of important work that you're doing. And so thinking from the perspective of internet policy, net neutrality would be one example, but there's probably other interesting ones that you're thinking about what we need to be careful not to lose as we move forward with the internet.
Well, I mean, we're about to lose net neutrality in certainly in the United States. So that's going to be a big shift. This whole fake news thing is a really big problem because it really, unless we come up with other infrastructures. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it certainly is getting depressing.
Sorry.
Thank you so Stephanie, you had one more?
Just one more sort of political question. When you were at the FTC, how concerned are they at the higher level about this more meta question? So, like the other night, a bunch of us civil society guys were all chatting, and somebody said, try this out, guys. And we were all around the world, so, Japan, South Africa. Type into Google, the Holocaust is. And we were gobsmacked. We got nothing but Holocaust denial. You were lucky if you got, a Wikipedia page, and it started out talking about Holocaust denial. If I were at the FTC and I was, as you introduced them, the kind of guardians of the internet, I'd be really worried. You know, you got a constitution that is going to stop you from interfering with free speech. But you can't have a situation where the 50% of Americans probably think Cher is a zombie now. Cher being dead.
Yeah.
They don't understand how the ad network works.
Well,
It's a problem.
so when we did the election vulnerability, the very first thing that we did was a really interesting thing. And if you Googled in the United States, where do I go vote? I live in such and such place, where do I go vote? You couldn't find it. That's pretty amazing. All the things you can find on the internet, you couldn't find this. You know? And you could find it sometimes in New York City. You could find it in New York City, but you couldn't find it in other cities, you couldn't find it in other places. And so we were amazed. We had to do this deep learning stuff to find where the polling place is. And then we set up our own webpage called votegps.org. And so the people would actually know where to vote. Because in the United States, the way tens of thousands of voters have historically always been disenfranchised is they get these official phone calls or official letters or official notifications to go to the wrong voting place. So that has happened every election cycle. And so we became really aggressive. So it turns out, though, that Pew and Google had spent something like $10 million to solve this problem that a few students and I were doing. But the interesting thing about that comes back to yours is, but by November, Google got this, they nailed it. They nailed it. So as we came towards the election, they put us out of business. We didn't no longer need to do GPS because now anywhere in the country you could Google, and the first thing that came up was those special forms that they do. And so I actually find that this is the Facebook example of fake news I gave, I think is a problem that Facebook should have an interest in solving. I think Google has an interest in solving that problem, and Google, I think, could do a lot to solve that problem. Huh? Well, we got one more hand up. Should we go one more, or let's say?
You sure? It's your call.
Okay, one more. Last word.
You mentioned earlier that Google might not have an interest in solving some of these problems because the people who care a great deal at Google still have to go to their board members and say, hey, we want to do this great project. They say how much it's going to cost. They don't want to do it. With that in mind, what role can regulators should take to change these sorts of things, recognizing that particularly in the area of data privacy and protection, in Europe we're getting these very big stick responses where we're like, you don't do what we say you should do, we're going to give you a big fine. Do you see in North America similar trends towards hard?
That is so not happening in the United States. That is so not happening.
And I don't know how to make the companies care to the extent that they're going to have these big picture solutions without market pressures. But you might not get the market pressures, people don't know what's going on. So I find you get into this regulatory loop where you don't really know how to resolve these huge problems. I don't know if you do that.
Me either. But we'll work on it. Okay. Thank you very much.